This summer, our latest adult forum study is a journey through the whole Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And this most recent past Sunday, we did a whirlwind tour of the book of Genesis as the introduction to the section we call the Torah, or sometimes called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And that led us right from the get-go to take a brief detour, which has brought us here. This is right now at Community of Christ, our current fellowship hall, right? It's where we have church meals and sometimes meetings. Tables get set up for groups that meet here. People have their birthday parties for their kids, that kind of thing. But it was originally the worship space. This at first was the primary space for this congregation, and it was where worship would happen on Sundays. The chairs would all be set up for worship, and then they'd be rearranged for any other use throughout the week. And we were talking about how a few years ago here, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of this congregation with a cool little memory book. And in the course of that compilation, you would have some people who might refer to this place as the fellowship hall. You might have other people who refer to this as the original sanctuary. Others might just call it, this room is the church, because that's what it was at first. All of those recollections would be accurate, all of them would be right, but they would also reveal something about who's doing the storytelling. Somebody who's only been a member here since we built another space to be our sanctuary and worship space. Someone who's only known this as the fellowship hall would call this the fellowship hall. Other people who've known this in a bunch of different ways might refer to it as the original church building, or the original sanctuary, or the original worship space, or they might say both and. It's the worship space and now it's the fellowship hall. Each of those brings a clue about who's doing the storytelling, who's doing the remembering, and where they are in time, but also might emphasize slightly different things about what this space is for. Calling this the room where we eat together suggests something intimate and close, us eating across the table at a meal together, or sharing comfort with one another after a funeral at a luncheon. Others who think of this as the place where we have our meetings will sort of suggest a different picture, or those who remember this as the worship space will be suggesting something different, right? Different names, different titles suggest not only when in time, but also maybe who's doing the storytelling. The book of Genesis does the same thing, and the fact that the book of Genesis starts from the get-go with a couple of different strands of storytelling side by side tells us something about how we're supposed to read the book. There are a number of strands within the book of Genesis that use one particular title for God. Elohim is the Hebrew word, and it's sort of a title that means God, and it comes from the generic word for God, like capital G or lowercase g. There are other strands that refer to God by a particular name, the covenant name God gave to the people. That story will come later, Yahweh, which we think means something like I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And then there are a couple of places where we'll get both side by side. The Lord is our English rendering of Yahweh, and God with a capital G is the usual rendering of Elohim. And you might get them side by side, or you might get one emphasis here and one emphasis here. Instead of treating these like we have to choose one or the other, it's worth saying, these are different ways of telling the story, different strands that have all been brought together into one book. That's a compilation of memory, just like the compilation of memories we made here at Community of Christ for our 50th anniversary. The book of Genesis is like that. And so, right from the get-go, we have 2 different ways of telling the story of creation. Genesis 1, in which Elohim, this sort of universal way of talking about God as creator of all things, powerful and orderly, like a king or a master artist, just making things happen by decree, by speaking, and the world comes into existence. There's one telling, and then there's Genesis 2, which sort of pictures God like a potter or a gardener getting dirt under the old divine fingernails, making and shaping the first human beings out of the dust of the earth and breathing into them. Each of those carries a different title or name for God. Elohim, the creator who speaks and brings things into existence. Yahweh, the God who breathes into the dust. And throughout the book of Genesis, you'll notice there are places where sometimes God is referred to as the Lord, and it's that covenant name Yahweh. There's places where God is referred to as just God, or the Lord God, or variations. This tells us something about how this book came together. And instead of being afraid or going, oh my goodness, this looks like it took a long time. It wasn't all one day, one person sitting down at their typewriter. It wasn't. These were stories that were handed down first orally around the campfire or as bedtime stories, and only later did we take all of them and put them side by side, each of them holding something up different about the story or about the character of God. Once you know that, then it doesn't have to be scary as you're reading through the rest of the book of Genesis. So after those two different ways of telling the story of creation, the intimate, close one of Genesis 2, the powerful, divine, orderly one of Genesis 1, you get between Genesis 3 and 5 ways that things fall apart, from an initial refusal to accept the boundaries God set by eating the fruit in the garden, to then murder in the very next generation. Then that leads to the story of the flood, which in Genesis is meant to build toward the conclusion where God hangs up the bow in the sky as a way of saying, I'm not going to do this anymore. We sometimes read the story of the end of the flood and go, oh, this is the story of where rainbows come from. I don't think that's the point. God says, I'm hanging up my bow, as if to say, change in divine policy here. I'm no longer going to wipe out all creation every time you might deserve it. Even if you've done something terrible, I will find a new way, a different way to mend and restore all of creation, which then leads perfectly 2 chapters later into God's call to Abram and Sarai. This is how God begins to restore and redeem all of creation, not by zapping us or wiping us out every time somebody has done something wrong. If God had to do that every morning, the universe would be wiped out all over again. Instead, God says, I will live with this world as it is and work through it, working through individual people and a family line. We Christians would go, eventually that leads to the story of Jesus. But here, right here in Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah become the beginning of that story and an alternative way of saving the world that doesn't require wiping everything out every time somebody does something wrong. We get stories about Abram and Sarai, and then their new names, Abraham and Sarah, and the covenant God makes with them that is this one-sided, universal sort of I'm going to bless you and give you land and descendants and bless all peoples in the world through you. And then we get the story of Abraham and his son Isaac, and Isaac sort of as the next generation that carries on that promise, while at the same time, Genesis complicates the narrative and reminds us there's another son in the picture. Abraham has a son Ishmael with a servant slave girl Hagar who is treated really badly, but God doesn't ignore her or her son Ishmael. The book of Genesis doesn't write him out of the story. It says, look, even when the human beings mess things up and complicate things, God reserves the right to care about and bless Ishmael as well. The story of Genesis is in some ways, yes, definitely the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and how that leads to the rest of the story of Israel. But it also is willing to stop and go, but God cares about a bigger picture that includes everybody. We aren't there to how this unfolds for everybody yet, but there are hints of it along the way. So then from Abraham's story to Isaac's story to Jacob's story, then we end up with Jacob's generation of children and a whole little novella about Jacob's son Joseph and his other brothers leading them into Egypt. That eventually sets things up so that the whole rest of the Torah's story, the story about being enslaved in Egypt and being set free and how to live differently as people who've been set free, all of that has to be set up by the book of Genesis that begins with a world that God made good, that human beings are a part of wrecking, and then God's refusal to give up on making that world right again and choosing the strange way of healing and redeeming the world through a family, the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that will eventually somehow bless all the families of the earth. It is super duper broad brushstrokes, but that's how the book of Genesis works. And it allows multiple different strands of storytelling all to be brought side by side. So we're going to pick up this coming week with not just the book of Exodus, but a whirlwind tour of the rest of the Torah, how the other laws and commandments of the Torah relate to that central story of being set free from slavery in Egypt, and how God's call is not to be a new version of Pharaoh's Egypt. But we hope you can join us in person for that conversation. And when you miss, catch up with these video summaries along the way. Join us all summer long for this journey through the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament.